Hello, everyone. Welcome today to the second session of ARCS Forward. I'm just going to jump right on in and get started because we have a ton of great content today, and I want to get as much as possible from our experts. Today, we're going to be learning about carbon emissions and offsets, global and local research. My name is Jessica Turner-Skoff. I am a member of the Illinois chapter of the ARCS Foundation. I have a doctorate in biology, and I'm currently serving as Morton Arboretum's first science communication leader. I also am a member of the board of directors of the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, an editorial advisor for the scientific journal Plants, People, Planet, an adjunct professor for the Associated Colleges of the Chicago region, and I was the recipient of the American Horticultural Society's 2020 Emerging Horticultural Professional Award. And I'm really honored to be here today moderating this session. ARCS Forward is a new initiative of the ARCS Foundation, and it's really focused on bringing the network of 15 chapters together and expanding this network to include others who have an interest in science and science education, as well as those who may not be as familiar with the ARCS Foundation. ARCS stands for the Achievement Rewards for College Scientists. The mission of the ARCS Foundation is to advance science in the United States by providing financial awards to the academically outstanding U.S. citizens studying to complete degrees in science, technology, engineering, and medical research. So for more information about the ARCS Foundation, please check out arcsfoundation.org. And if you are a member of the ARCS Foundation, I think you should give yourself a pat on the back because I think it's just an incredible program that's doing amazing work. So on behalf of the ARCS Forward Committee, thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be featuring two scientists from Illinois and the Northern California chapters of the ARCS Foundation to discuss environmental issues concerning carbon emissions. And this is all based on the responses to the surveys that were sent out after the kickoff session in May. The community decided to ask these two scholars to speak to address the environmental science because so many people were interested in learning more about that. So the people are listening to you for sure. These sessions are really designed to meet the interests of the participants. So please, please, please fill out the post-session survey to tell us what you would like to learn about. So let's get started. But first, let me introduce our two scientists. Each scientist will provide further context about their background and their research. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout. So each scientist will present their information, and then we will have a Q&A period at the end. So first, we have Sophie Ruehr from UC Berkeley and the Northern California chapter of ARCS. Sophie is a brilliant researcher, reporter, and she composes songs for the jazz guitar. We also have Dr. Becky Barak, a scholar alum from the Illinois chapter. Becky is a graduate of Northwestern University, an excellent communicator. I've seen her in action, it's incredible. And founder and project lead for Plant Love Stories. And she is a researcher at the Chicago Botanic Garden. So thank you so much. Really excited to hearing from both of you. Sophie, please take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here and get to see all of you on Zoom. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can show you some cool pictures while I talk. Oh, maybe that's the wrong one. Are you all seeing a PowerPoint slide? Looks good? Okay, awesome. So I'm a second year now PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I study climate science. And today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about my research and using a metaphor of friendship to describe how I try to predict the very complex behavior of the Earth and its climate. So to begin with some motivation, this year we've seen a really horrible drought in the US. This is the continental US, and this map is showing the drought. The dark colors are areas where there's an exceptional drought, and the colors throughout the map are showing anywhere that it's drier than usual. So you'll see that it's really focused in the Southwest, but even New England and Florida are experiencing drier than normal conditions. And climate scientists like myself are interested in what's causing this to happen, and also with climate change, trying to predict whether drought events like these might become more intense or more frequent in the future. And doing that can be kind of tricky because this drought arises from a bunch of different factors, like how much sun there is, how cloudy it is, how much rain there is, how hot it is, how much carbon there is in the atmosphere. All these different elements of the Earth's climate system come together to create an event like this. And we're hoping to better predict these types of events in the future so we can better prepare for them and manage them. So that's just some motivation. I'm now going to talk a bit about friendship to kind of guide us through how we would even begin to approach a question like predicting the Earth's climate. So I would like you all to imagine a group of your friends, maybe some pals from college, maybe your family, any group of your friends. Think about them in your mind. For me, I think about my friends from middle school. This is me in the front with Dory and Summer and Emily. Our other friend Olivia is also part of this friend group. We've been friends since middle school. We know each other really well. And our friend group is composed of all these different individual relationships that have changed over time. And our group as a whole is made up of all these individual relationships. To kind of go further on this, say, here's me. Me and Summer have this one-on-one friendship. If you introduce another person to a friend group, you get some more relationships. Another person adds even more complexity. And finally, if you have 5 people in a group of friends, you end up with all these different relationships that are complex and change over time. And the state of the friend group itself is dependent on all these individual relationships that are both ways and make things depending on the context or how often you see each other. So we can think about friend groups in the context of climate change because the Earth is very similar to a friend group. It has all these different parts in it that relate to one another and determine the state of the system, the state of the climate at any given time. So there are trees, there's the atmosphere, there's water, and all these different elements of the system are in these complex relationships with one another. They influence each other. And so if something changes in one part of the system, that will affect the entire rest of the system and vice versa. Climate scientists are interested in studying this because it's really complex and also because it's really important. And if we want to get better at predicting things like drought or predicting things like climate change, we really need to have a good understanding of this complex web of relationships. What I study is one little part of this system, a place where a bunch of these different relationships intersect, and that's plants. So plants do this magical thing called photosynthesis. This might have been something you learned about in high school biology class. They take light from the sun and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the ground, and they fix the carbon. They store it in their leaves and their roots as sugars, and they produce oxygen. So this is a really powerful and important process that happens in the Earth to change the amount of carbon and oxygen in our atmosphere and also how much water there is in the ground. And plants, because they're part of the system, these relationships might change over time depending on how much water there is, how much carbon there is in the atmosphere, how cloudy it is, how hot it is. And what I'm interested in is trying to predict these types of relationships as the climate changes around us. So why does it matter to predict how plants are functioning? Well, a lot of companies and countries have increasingly been calling themselves carbon neutral or trying to become carbon neutral. JetBlue, for example, has recently launched this whole campaign where they're saying that they're CO2 neutral and they'll talk about it on their flights. And I wanted to just spend a minute kind of trying to visualize this with you all. So here's JetBlue. They say every flight has a certain amount of carbon that it emits, and I'm just visualizing it for you, even though it's not visible. And JetBlue says, okay, we'll plant a few trees, and those trees are going to offset the amount of carbon that we're releasing into the atmosphere. So in total, there's no net release of carbon. Well, there are some issues here because they're planting these trees in this complex system of the Earth's climate that isn't static. And they're relying on relationships between trees and carbon that might actually change over time or might not be true in certain places. So in reality, some of those trees might die because it's really dry and there's a drought. Other ones might burn up in a wildfire. Or some of the trees just might not get as big as JetBlue is expecting because of different conditions that are preventing them from growing really big. And in any of these situations, the amount of carbon that is sequestered is actually less than JetBlue is expecting. And in total, there is a net release of carbon into the atmosphere. So I'm curious about these types of uncertainties, and my research is focusing in on how water and trees are interacting and how that's affecting carbon sequestration. So my final edit to this JetBlue's picture of being carbon neutral is to put a big question mark, because we just don't know about a lot of this, especially when we're trying to think about it moving forward into the future of climate change. But that's not to say that we don't know anything. We actually do know a lot about the climate system, and we know a lot about carbon. This is a really cool figure that I'm going to take a few minutes to explain, because it's a little complicated, but I think it says a lot. So first, I'll draw your attention to the horizontal axis here. This is a timeline going from 1750 until the present. And on the vertical axis, you'll see there's some positive values above 0 and negative values below 0. And what this is showing is basically where the carbon in the atmosphere is coming from and where it's going. So in the positive range, this is what's coming into the atmosphere. And you'll notice this gray area here that's increasing exponentially. That's carbon being released from burning fossil fuels. The brown line is carbon released from deforestation, from cutting down trees. On the other side of the axis, in the negative region, we're seeing where the sinks of carbon are, where the carbon is going. So some of it goes into the ocean, that's that dark blue color here. Some of it stays in the atmosphere, which is the light blue. And then a lot of it, which is this green color in my area of research, is the carbon that's getting taken out of the atmosphere by plants. And I want you to notice two things about this green area. First of all, it's been increasing from 1900 until today. It's gone up a lot, how much carbon is being sequestered by plants. And it's kind of keeping pace with the emissions that we're emitting to the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. It's continuing to take up about a third of the carbon that we release every year. And secondly, there's a lot of interannual variation. And what I mean by that is that some years we're actually seeing a positive release of carbon into the atmosphere from plants. And in other years, we're seeing a huge, huge drawdown. So it's really variable. Some years plants are eating up a lot of carbon, and other years they're not doing as well. So scientists are curious to try to figure out why is this interannual variation happening? Can we better predict it? And also, will this increase in the carbon sink of plants continue to increase into the future, or is it going to somehow level out at some point? So how do we actually go about studying this? And I'm going to return to our metaphor of friendship again. So here's a picture of me and my friends from high school prom. You might notice here's me, and there's Summer and Dory, Olivia and Emily. And I put this picture here because I wanted to just highlight that friends can be friends for a long time. And it's kind of hard to, if you're trying to understand a friend group, it would be impossible to actually run a controlled experiment like you might in other branches of science, where you keep everything the same and change one thing and then see how the system reacts. It's really hard to do that with friends. It would be hard to tell everyone to be quiet and have only one person talk. So what I do in my research, and how you might understand a friend group, is work with really big data sets. And you can think about this as, if you know your friends for a long time, if you've been friends with them for many, many years, you have a lot of experience with them and a lot of information about all your friends. And you can start predicting how they might respond to certain situations or their behavior in certain contexts. So just like a friend group, if you have a lot of data, a lot of information about the climate, you can start predicting patterns and predicting behavior with a large enough data set. So now I'm going to get a little bit more into my research, and I'm going to talk about two different types of data that I'm working with to start understanding this complex Earth system. So the first one is a big data set gathered from all these different stations around the US and Canada. Each of these dots is showing a different station that's collecting information about the environment, about how much photosynthesis is happening, how much water there is in the ground, how sunny it is, the temperature. And together, all of this data can help us start seeing patterns in how trees are responding to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. Here's a picture of just one of those stations from that map. This is one in California, kind of near San Francisco. And it's a tall tower. It has all these cool solar panels on it for energy, and some nitrogen tanks and oxygen tanks, and some other devices on it that help it read the environment. And it can actually see or measure plants doing photosynthesis on the ground. So this is really a very cool data set, I think. What I'd like you to notice about this site is that it's very green. The understory, all the grass is really green and the trees are really green. And that's because it's been really wet. This is a picture from springtime after a lot of rain, and the system is really green and verdant because of all the rain. In the summertime, however, things get really dry. It's really hot, there's no rain, and all of the grass dies out. Interestingly, though, at this site, these trees are still doing photosynthesis. They're still sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, and they need water to do that. And so the soil is super dry, and what they're doing is they're actually using their roots to access groundwater. So water deep down in the ground, they're pulling it up to use in photosynthesis. This is just to kind of visualize it. And I'm sorry, this picture is a little blurry, but just if you were drilling down to make a well at your house, there's this groundwater table below the surface. And if you dig down deep enough, you'll find the soil is saturated with water. Like if you're digging up a sandcastle at a beach, at some point you'll hit saturated sand, and that's kind of the water table. The same thing is happening underground. And at this site, the trees are using groundwater to continue doing photosynthesis, even when it's really dry.
Yes.
What's also interesting about these sites that I have compiled that map that I showed you of all the different stations is that each of those stations has information about the groundwater and how it's changing over time. So this figure again is showing a timeline on the horizontal axis, and this vertical axis is showing the depth to the water table. So how far you'd have to go down before you hit the water table. And so you'll notice in some years, like in 2011, the water table is really shallow. You wouldn't have to go down very deep to hit that saturated soil that's full of water. And in other years, like in 2014, there was this big drought and the water table fell really deep into the ground. And since the trees at this site are relying on groundwater, I'm curious how these interannual variations might be affecting the plants at the site. I'm not going to get into too much details about this figure, but this is a result I recently had from some of my research, where I've been seeing that the plants do pretty well at continuing to sequester carbon when the water table is kind of above a certain level. But then if the water table drops too low, plants start not working as well and can't sequester as much carbon as they normally would. So this is kind of an exciting result. It might seem kind of intuitive and obvious, but not that many people have actually looked at groundwater and how that affects carbon sequestration. And also it's a little tricky to quantify actually how much carbon is being lost if the groundwater level is too low. So in other words, it's important to quantify the amount of carbon that is not being sequestered, that is still remaining in the atmosphere if the groundwater is really, really deep. And this might have implications for, say, if JetBlue wanted to plant some trees, it might influence which species they pick, because they might want to pick a species that has really deep roots in certain areas, or have a better sense of if we are pumping groundwater out of the ground for agriculture, that also might affect plants' abilities to sequester carbon. So those are some implications for this work. And now, before I finish up, I just wanted to point out one other very cool data set that I've started working with more recently, which is data collected by satellites. So these two movies are showing satellite images of photosynthesis on the left and groundwater on the right, from different times of the year and different years. These images are all collected by satellites that are orbiting the Earth and have fancy cameras that can see different processes on the ground. So as I mentioned before, it's really important to have big data sets when we're trying to understand this complex Earth system. And these are really exciting data sets because now we can also start thinking about spatial relationships. And right now I'm working on some research that is considering how variations in groundwater might be affecting variations in photosynthesis from year to year over the entire Earth. So this is something I'm starting just now, and I'm very excited to be working on this next project in conjunction with the research I just showed you that I'm finishing up. I also just, again, wanted to go back to my friends because I think a lot about how we're going to sustainably manage our climate and continue to study the Earth moving forward and take care of it. And I think just like a friend group, it will take some work and will require a lot of work. These are my friends in 2014 when we graduated from high school, and this year when we got together for a pajama party. Like a friend group, the Earth system won't just kind of survive and be okay if we ignore it. It's going to take some communication and some effort to keep things working properly, and some good listening and some good research. So I'm very grateful to have my ARCS fellowship. It's been really amazing to have some more support in doing this work and really be able to focus on my studies. So thank you all for supporting ARCS and for being here today. Here's my email if you have any questions or want to get in touch about any of this research or talk more. And I think Becky is now going to take it away and tell us a bit more about how we go from this kind of big global thinking to actually applying it in some practical case studies. So I'm excited to hear her talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And really quick, and if everyone can please make sure they're muting their microphone, that will be really beneficial so it doesn't interrupt Becky's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Is that working? Sorry, that was not as seamless of a transition as I was hoping for, but hopefully you can see my presentation. And so, yeah, as Sophie just mentioned, we're talking about carbon emissions and carbon offsets from global and local perspectives. And I'm going to talk about some local research that I'm doing here in Chicago. And I would call my talk Lawn Alternatives for Habitat Infrastructure and Climate Change Resilience. So I'm going to talk to you for 18 minutes. I'm going to start my timer about lawns. So get ready. Okay, this is me. My name is Becky Barak. As Jessica said earlier, I'm a conservation scientist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and I'm also an adjunct professor at Northwestern. We have a joint graduate program in plant biology and conservation between Northwestern and the Chicago Botanic Garden. I study conservation and restoration with a focus on native plants. I'm going to talk about native plants a lot. This photo is actually me at Morton Arboretum, where Jessica works on I study on a prairie plot experiment there. I'm not going to talk about that experiment, but that is what a lot of my field work looks like. And I'm an ARCS alum from way back in 2010 and 2011 when I was a master's student. So I have this picture here of Zion National Park, which is, I was studying native plants in Zion for my master's degree when I was funded at the very, very beginning of my journey as a scientist. So I'm very thankful to ARCS for being such a wonderful part of that process. The work that I'm going to talk about today is very collaborative. So here's some of my collaborators and some of their organizations. I'm working with Lauren Umek from Chicago Park District, Rebecca Tonietto from University of Michigan Flint, and Liz Anakozik from the University of Wisconsin, and specifically the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. I am also grateful to the Epley Foundation for Research for funding the initial stages of this project. And we're also partnering with Cardno Native Plant Nursery in Indiana on plants and maintenance of our experiment. And I also want to point out that Liz, in addition to being a PhD student in the history of restoration, is also an amazing artist and illustrator and All of the illustrations that you will see in this talk are done by Liz, but I strongly suggest that you check out some of her work. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about lawns. And I was looking for a picture of like the perfect quintessential lawn, sort of the American dream of lawns. And I thought that I would find this picture at This Old House website. And I did. This is a photo from This Old House. But as I was looking for this, and I was expecting to find a post that was going to tell me all about how to maintain my lawn so that it would be perfect and weed free. And I did find that information, but I also found this, 5 alternatives to grass lawns. So even This Old House is talking about lawn alternatives now. So I'm not the only person who's talking about them. And lawn alternatives is a really kind of pervasive idea of people thinking like, maybe having a green lawn only is not the best way to go. Of course, I can also read about the 5 best sprinklers and how to revitalize my lawn, but that is something interesting that even This Old House website has a post up right now about lawn alternatives. So the fact that there are so many posts and ideas and books about lawn alternatives is because lawn has some problems. And you might know that on a micro level as someone who may have taken care of a lawn, in that they require consistent mowing. They dry out very fast, and this has to do with what Sophie was just talking about. The lawn grasses have extremely short roots. They do not absorb a lot of water at all. And it's a monoculture. The whole point of a lawn is to have it be just one grass species with no weeds. And those are some problems on a small scale. And the reason is because in terms of this consistent mowing, gas lawnmowers are big emitters of carbon dioxide. And in fact, some of the worst environmental implications of lawn is just because of how much mowing and how much gas is required to take care of a lawn and to keep it at that short level. Also, since lawn has these really short roots, it dries out very fast, which means that it requires a lot of watering. And conversely to everything Sophie was just saying, it doesn't absorb urban stormwater. And in cities like Chicago, we have a ton of urban stormwater. Even when we have droughts, we have these huge rain events with tons of stormwater. And if you have a lawn, you will note that a lot of the stormwater just runs right off of it. There was actually an article in the New York Times recently about flooding in Chicago. And we were like, we made it into the New York Times. Just kidding. Chicago has a complex, in case you didn't know. Also, with lawn being a monoculture, the whole idea is that it's just this grass lawn. So there's no support for pollinators or other wildlife, no habitat for other plants, and a ton of herbicides and fertilizers that go into keeping it as this monoculture. Lawn is also expensive and time consuming to maintain. And if you think about the scale of lawn, lawns are actually the #1 irrigated crop in North America. 3 times more land area in the United States goes towards lawn. So we have more lawn than we have corn, more than any other crop, and 3 times as much. And some more factoids about that is that lawn maintenance costs more than $5.2 billion for fertilizer, $700 million for pesticides, 800 million gallons of gasoline to cut it, and between 30 and 60% of municipal potable water supplies go toward keeping lawns green every year. So that is kind of a problem. And the reason is because this is the most common species. This is an illustration by Liz. The most common lawn grass is called Poa pratensis, or Kentucky bluegrass. And it just has this really, really dinky root system. It grows, it doesn't care whether it's mowed, it keeps growing, but it has such a short root system, which means that it can't sequester a lot of carbon and it can't absorb a lot of water, and it needs to be watered really constantly. In contrast to the Kentucky bluegrass, which is this turf grass right here, native species have much deeper root systems. These numbers are in meters. So we have prairie plants that can actually grow roots 20 feet into the ground, even if above ground, all you're seeing is something that's 3 feet high. So they can have this much more extensive root system underground, which can do a lot better at some of those jobs. So just to summarize some of the problems with lawn, they have to be mowed a lot, which takes work, money, and gas. Ooh. They're watered a lot. They require a lot of chemicals. They don't absorb a lot of water. There's no support for pollinators unless you allow some weeds in your lawn. So what is the alternative? Well, it turns out there are a lot of alternatives to grass lawns that are proposed. And they range from ground covers, which I would argue, this one is called goutweed. If any of you have experience with goutweed, I'm sorry to you because it's horrible. I had it. It's a terrible, terrible invasive weed. And yeah, it will grow very well in shade, but you don't want it to because it's just really bad. So that is marketed in some places as a lawn alternative. So on one hand, you could have some pretty bad invasive weeds marketed as lawn alternatives. And on the completely other side of that are people and organizations such as this one called Lawn to Wildflowers, that encourage people to completely convert their lawn into like full wildflower meadows or prairies to support pollinators. So there's a huge range in things that people are calling lawn alternatives. I would never recommend that anybody plant goutweed as a lawn alternative. It is much, much worse than Kentucky bluegrass. And there are all these different things that are marketed and that are sold and that are written about as lawn alternatives, but there isn't a lot of data on whether and how these lawn alternatives compare to actual grass and how they compare to one another. So that's where this experiment comes in that I'm going to tell you about. So this is an experiment with my collaborators. We're testing 10 different lawns and lawn alternatives in a plot experiment. And this is in partnership with Chicago Park District. What's really awesome about that is the Chicago Park District manages a lot of land area and a lot of parkland with a lot of lawn. And anything that we're able to find out, they will be able to implement in these parks. So we have a really nice connection to being able to apply the research. Another thing I will say is that, and I'll say this now, is that I'm not hating on lawns. You can't play soccer in like a wildflower meadow. So there's definitely reasons that we need grass lawns, but there are a lot of land areas that are just grass lawn because nobody knows what else to do with them. And we're mowing over here, so we might as well mow over here too. So there is a lot of opportunity to convert some of that really underutilized lawn area to something else that might provide economic environmental benefits without trying to break people's ankles because they have to play soccer in a prairie. So these are our two sites on the south and west sides of Chicago, Marquette Park and Marion R. Burns Park. And we have 10 different lawn treatments. So you can see they're replicated 4 times here at Marquette Park and 3 times at Marion Burns Park. And these are what the 10 treatments are. I'm just going to go through them quickly in case you find them in other places. So we have 3 lawn treatments. Pre-established lawn is just whatever was there. So whatever park lawn already exists. Then we have 2 lawns that we established from sod and from seed. Then we have 2 alternative grasses. So these are still grasses, but one of them is a low growing, less mowing fescue. It's marketed as eco-grass, and it's something that has a slower growth rate, so it doesn't have to be mowed as frequently as Kentucky bluegrass. And it is supposed to have a deeper root system to help absorb some of that water and potentially sequester carbon. We have buffalo grass, which is a native species. So this is the first native grass species to North America that we're looking at, which is a similar idea. It's a single grass species, but shouldn't have to be mowed as often or watered as often as our regular Kentucky bluegrass. We have one treatment that is a mixture of native sedges, grasses, and rushes. So sedges and rushes are plants that are not grasses. They're not in the grass plant family, but they look a lot like grasses. But here we're adding some diversity. We have different types of plants that are growing together, but we're hoping that they'll sort of have a grass look to them. And then we have 3 treatments that have lawn grasses or sedge grasses, sedges, grasses, and rushes, but we've also included wildflowers. And the idea here is to potentially be able to support pollinators and wildlife and add some visual appeal and add some biological diversity to these grasses by introducing wildflowers. All of these wildflowers and all of these grasses are short. Our idea was we wanted to test things that are about lawn length. So they're not super high treatments that are going to make people nervous or make people think that we're just planting a bunch of weeds. But our last treatment is a full prairie restoration. In this treatment, we didn't care how tall the plants were. We just used plants that are typically used in a prairie. And our thought with that was kind of, can any of these lawn alternatives compete with just turning everything into a restored prairie? So all of our 10 treatments range from business as usual or grass as usual to a full prairie restoration, and they differ in their diversity and their nativeness. And so we're testing all of these treatments, all of these lawn alternatives for things like plant survivorship and cover and diversity, how much carbon they store, how much water they can absorb, how many pollinators visit them, and public opinion. So do people hate it? Can people imagine it being in a park that they visit? Can people imagine it being at their own house or at a friend's house? So we just installed this experiment this summer, and we've collected data one time on all of our plots. We have found that the plants we planted are surviving. The lawn alternatives really do require less watering and less mowing, but we have a lot of weeds in year one. So we killed a bunch of grass to be able to make these plots. And so lots of weed seeds that were in the seed bank are currently coming out. So we have a lot of weeds. We're going to be mowing everything to try and keep the weeds down this year and hope that next year we'll have more establishment of our plants that we planted. So that's what we're testing, and that's how we're testing native plants. And I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about how lawn alternatives might factor into your life if you are interested. And these are two examples. We actually posted about this idea on Twitter and posted about our experiment on Twitter. And these are two responses from people who said, oh, I did that. This is a house in Minnesota where they converted their whole lawn into prairie restoration. And another house in the Northwest where they have been working on this for 5 years, and they have introduced trees and just a whole bunch of different floral diversity. So I'm not saying everyone should go home and do this. I think very, very committed people do this. I can't. I have 2 kids. I have 2 boys. They like to play soccer. They like to play football. They wouldn't be able to do this if I converted my entire yard to being these types of lawn alternatives. So I'm going to provide some ideas on a spectrum of sort of dipping your toes into this idea of lawn alternatives. So you can start small. You can become a lazy lawnmower to support pollinators. This is actually a term that they used in the book. I mean, in this paper. If you mow your lawn every 2 weeks instead of every week, you provide habitat for pollinators, and you're mowing half as often, so you're releasing as much carbon dioxide into the air. If you embrace or tolerate some lawn weeds, you can support pollinators and reduce the need for mowing and reduce the need for fertilizer and herbicides and stuff, because you're not trying to kill all of the weeds that are in your lawn. And this is an example picture of something called microclover. It is literally the white clover that is a lawn weed that is now marketed as a lawn alternative. And if part of your lawn is clover, you don't have to mow it as often because it doesn't look as tall because the clover stays short. So microclover is the fancy way to call the white clover that might already be in your lawn. You can just say, I don't have weeds, I have microclover. You can convert part of your lawn to native perennial beds. They will not require a lot of upkeep once they're in, and you don't have to convert your entire lawn into a prairie. You can check out some of the lawn alternatives that I talked about, which are on this website, rethinkinglawns.org, or there's many resources and books and articles about lawn alternatives. But I would reiterate, make sure any ground covers that you might be interested in using are not invasive species. And I'll just say this now, I'm sorry if I've cursed your walks around the neighborhood after you've heard this talk. If you see your neighbor leaving their sprinkler on while it's currently raining outside, you might be mad about it in a way that you might not have thought about it before talking about lawns right now for a bit. And to go a little bit bigger than that, you can work with your neighborhood or your city or your county or your park to consider and encourage lawn alternatives, and in turn to rethink lawn related regulations. So in a lot of areas, if you don't mow your lawn for 2 weeks, you can get a citation, you can get a fine for having something that looks too weedy. And that's, you know, there's reasons for that, but there's also reasons to really lean away from that and lean towards trying to encourage a greater diversity of plantings, a greater diversity of potential lawn alternatives. And I have this image here, which is from the Minnesota Residential Pollinator Project. Your yard can be the change, and Minnesota actually incorporated incentives to homeowners to incorporate pollinator-friendly plantings into their yards. So if towns can have an incentive for that, that's really awesome. That's all I have to say about lawn alternatives, but I did want to mention Plant Love Stories, which Jessica mentioned in her intro. Plant Love Stories is a story project where we collect and share stories about the plants that impact our lives. Our idea is that plants are too often part of the background, but they really play an integral role in our lives and in our relationships and in our friend groups, maybe too, Sophie. So I hope you'll check it out. And if you are inspired, you can share your story with us, and we can post it on Plant Love Stories. So that's all I have to say. I don't have my email address on this talk, but I'm more than happy if people want to reach out, I can put it in the chat. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Becky. I will say that you guys have made my life as a moderator very easy, because we are actually ahead of schedule. So thank you so much. And we now have time for questions. So, and first of all, I just kind of linking your two talks together, all I could think about is those celebrities that have those beautiful green gardens and grass, like in LA, and just with all the drought. It's just very frustrating with groundwater and all of that. But anyway, that's a nice segue. California may lose up to 30% of its trees to fire and drought. Is fire data going into data sets as concerns for CO2 emissions? And that's for Sophie.
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a big concern. I think that the fires last year in California, and also the ones I think the year before in Australia, you could see them globally in terms of how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. There can be big spikes of CO2 releases when there are big scale fires like that. So people are definitely concerned about fire and how much carbon is being released by those, especially when you think about the really old redwoods that we're burning that have been growing for centuries. So I think fire is a big concern, and some of my friends at Berkeley are studying that specifically. So there's a lot of work being done in that area. I hope I answered the question.
I have the next question. I believe this is directed for Becky. First bar on the depth chart, little carbon storage and close to the surface. Is that the desert?
Is that for me?
I think that's for you, Becky. Is that?
No, excuse me. It's my question. It's for Sophie. It's
oh,
her
okay,
chart.
great. I was looking at the time stamp. So yes.
Yep.
So
Could you just read the question one more time then?
the first bar on the depth chart, little carbon storage and close to the surface. Is that the desert?
I'm not sure which figure you're talking about. I think the figures that I was showing was just for that one site that I showed a picture of. So that site in California. I've also been looking at the desert a bit. The relationships are kind of different there because of there are different plant species and different soil properties. But generally what I've been seeing is when the water table drops really low, the plants don't do as well, which is kind of what you would expect. In desert systems, though, kind of surprisingly, it's more paired. So the water table drops because the plants are sucking up so much water. So you start seeing kind of different relationships depending on which ecosystem you're looking at.
Wonderful. This question is for Becky. Can wildflowers be mowed?
Yeah, I saw that question. That is a great question. Wildflowers can be mowed. So in our prairie restorations, we actually burn them. Prairies were burned for thousands of years by indigenous people to try to keep them prairies, actually, and prevent them from turning into forests. So a lot of prairie restorations are managed by fire, and the fire helps to reduce weeds. But in a lot of neighborhoods, you are not allowed to burn your yard. So so mowing kind of helps with that too. So you can actually mow wildflowers. Sometimes you want to make sure that you let them flower first, or you can let them go to seed, depending on how you want, whether you want to maintain them as flowering individuals or whether you want to reduce their numbers. But yeah, you can mow wildflowers, and they're perennial. They should grow back well the next year, and it will help prevent weeds from going to seed if you're able to cut them short in wildflower beds.
For Becky, does the federal government offer subsidies to the park system for grass alternatives?
So that is a great question. I saw that in the question in the chat, and I don't know that they directly do. So this person mentioned CRP and how there are government subsidies for turning some of your land, keeping some of your land as native plants. For park systems, I know that there is a lot of grant funding for infrastructure and a lot of grant funding for things like stormwater retention. So I believe that if parks departments were able to spin this as an infrastructure grant and as a stormwater retention project, that they would be able to apply funding that way. I don't know if there are specific funding opportunities for lawn alternatives. I hope that makes sense.
How does like Arizona's xeriscape compare with lawns, I assume?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So of course, this did not start in the Midwest where I am. This started in really dry habitats like Arizona and xeriscaping. And it is a really similar idea, right? It's the fact that we have these areas in residential towns and neighborhoods, and they don't have to be lawn. They can be something else. And maybe they can be something else that can help play a role, that can help reduce water usage, that can help support pollinators. So I think this whole thing that I'm working on really owes itself to the work with xeriscaping in the American West. And there is some work from Europe on tapestry lawns, I believe they call them. And they're really focused on very, very short spreading wildflowers. Our thing is a little different because we have sometimes too little water and sometimes too much water. And so that's kind of where this idea comes from, of trying to establish things that have really deep roots, because they should be able to survive better in times of low water and in times of high water. So it's not exactly the same, but it's definitely a really similar idea.
And then piggybacking off of that, I have in the questions, golf courses.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. How amazing would it be if all that, I mean, golf courses exist in the driest place during drought times and they're being constantly pelted with water from sprinklers. Yes, I think there are some great opportunities there, if not to just completely reclaim golf courses for nature, at least to try and use some lawn alternatives in those plantings.
I have a question for Sophie. Do you factor potential extinction debt into your models? For example, deer are severely impacting forest regeneration by overbrowsing saplings, excuse me.
That's a good question. I guess it's kind of interesting that we also got a question about fires, because going back to that idea of the complex system, there are all these different things that are impacting trees. And so fires and mortality and grazing and that type of stuff there are specialists who study each of those, and they would all argue that their thing that they're studying is kind of like the most important thing. So for some people, yeah, overgrazing or tree mortality is like the most important thing, and that's really what's causing these variations in carbon sequestration and what we should be focusing on. Other people might say it's fires. Other people might say it's drought. What I think it might be true is that it kind of depends on where you're looking and at the time scales you're looking at. So at least in my work, I'm not looking specifically at mortality yet. I probably will in the future. But I think it's kind of a question of how do you balance these different perspectives. And there's a lot of conversations about, if we're trying to model this, how complex should the models be? Should they include all of these processes, and which ones are the most important ones to be thinking about? So that's kind of an active question in the field, is how do we prioritize these different processes, and how do we account for all of them without making things too complicated?
Okay, wonderful. So I have a question on what are your thoughts about controlled burning, especially with like forests?
Yeah, I think that's, to me, well, I guess it's a good idea. I think, as Becky mentioned, Indigenous peoples in the States have been practicing burning and controlled burns for a long time to manage forests. And I think it's a good idea in a lot of places. I think it has to be done safely, and there's a lot of other concerns that go into burning responsibly, but I think it can be done, and a lot of people are advocating for not only controlled burns, but also kind of letting wildfire do what it will, and not even, I guess, controlling it less in terms of actually intentionally starting it in some places, but actually letting it be more of a random process. There's some management strategies in Yosemite that I've been reading about a bit that's kind of advocating for letting nature do her thing. And so yeah, I guess I'm pro controlled burns, and also pro, I think they call it managed wildfire is another approach as well.
Now I have a question for both of you, ladies. What are your thoughts on, what's the one thing that you think people can do as an individual to support, reducing carbon emissions or anything like that? What's your one like takeaway for everybody to, if you could make everybody in the world do it, what would it be?
That's a hard question, Jessica. Becky,
Yeah, I know it's a really hard question. I think if we can make everybody in the world do stuff, then we probably have a lot more options. If we can just make some people in the world do stuff, I think lobbying corporations and lobbying, your representatives, and trying to get some like actual movement in terms of alternative energy and climate mitigation and stuff like that. I think that's the number one thing we can do as individuals, is try and make action that's bigger than ourselves. But I also think that doing the things that we can do at our own houses, and trying to install solar panels or lawn alternatives or planting native plants, I think all of that is really important. But I think collectively pushing action is very, very important too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree with Becky, and it's very well said. I think one thing I've been thinking a bit about is trying to be open-minded about kind of alternative approaches. And I think, like Becky's talked about, kind of rethinking how we envision our spaces and the plants that we can control. I think being open to new ideas and embracing maybe kind of confusing or uncertain things could be really good. For example, with renewable energy, I know that some people are really against putting up wind farms, or are hesitant about other sources of power. So I think it's good to feel some sort of personal responsibility and not be a NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard type of advocate. So that's something I think about a bit as well.
Wonderful. And are there any other questions from the audience? This is your chance to pick the brain of these two amazing experts. Okay, are you aware of the seaweed products which retain water on lawn surfaces and tree root balls?
I don't think I am. If somebody wants to talk about that, I have been studying. I've been reading a lot about lawn alternatives, and I saw moss as a potential lawn alternative. And actually, a friend of mine that I was talking to before this talk, a subscriber of Martha Stewart Living, was showing me pictures of someone who had converted their whole property into being covered by moss. But I don't know about seaweed. No.
What I do know is that we're getting ready to plant some large trees, and the tree farm guy told me that there is a seaweed product that can be sprayed on the tree root balls as they are dug up, and it will hold the moisture in the root balls so that the odds of having your tree live are better. And he said you can use it on grassy surfaces or all over the place. And I hadn't heard of it, but my question was whether it would be a potential part of the solution in places where we need to retain water.
Yeah, I think that I'm definitely interested in looking more into that. That's the first I've heard of it. So thanks.
And as a plug for the Morton Arboretum, which we always advocate the right tree in the right place with the right care afterwards, we do have a plant clinic. If you have questions about plants, you can email them about your yard, anything like that. I'm sure they have a ton of information as well, and also how to plant trees and pick the right tree for your space. So that was just a perfect segue. I had to get that in as a representative. But I'm just really grateful for all of you being here today. Just thank you so much to Sophie and Becky. Phenomenal talks, so well done, and just really informative, and I really appreciate it. So at every session of ARCS, these ARC Forward events, you'll have the opportunity to hear from ARCS scholars from 15 different ARCS Foundation chapters. In fact, we have a list of over 40 ARCS scholars who are eager to speak about their research, so we have no shortage of content. The topics will range from medicine to artificial intelligence to the visual system of octopus. The slate and topics and speakers is in process of being developed, so stay tuned, and please let us know if there's something of particular that's of interest to you. As we saw with today's talk, everybody was interested in environmental science and they made it happen. So make sure you're putting your thoughts down and letting people know, because we will help make sure that that happens. The goal is for ARCS Forward to be interactive and informative, and in order to get your valued feedback, which will help shape future content, you'll be receiving a short survey along with a link to the recording of today's session, should you wish to rewatch or share it with others. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you next time, so be sure to mark your calendars for September 28th, 2021 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be learning about prostate cancer. So I'm Jessica Turner-Skoff. Thank you so much, Sophie Ruehr and Becky Barak, and from all of us at ARCS.